The sun burned low across the red horizon, spilling fire over the endless plains where the land seemed to breathe with dust and silence. In that silence, broken only by the far-off call of a hawk, a lone wagon creaked along a trail that had been cut deep by years of pioneers, chasing hope westward. Inside the wagon, cushioned by blankets though none of them were soft enough to quiet her pain, sat a woman heavy with child. Her hands clutched her swollen belly with the protectiveness of a mother who knew her time was drawing near. She was pale, her lips chapped from wind and thirst, but her eyes, though strained, still held courage. The man beside her, her husband, a tall figure with a hat pulled low against the fading light, drove the mules forward, his jaw tight with determination. His name was Thomas Avery, a ranch hand-turned wanderer, and his wife was Mary, a woman who had followed him through hardship, leaving behind the small comfort of kin for the uncertain promise of a better life. They had been traveling for weeks, fleeing drought and debt from the east, bound for the Nevada frontier where whispers of work and land called like a salvation. Yet, the road was cruel, and the woman's time had come sooner than expected. Every bump of the wagon sent pain through Mary's body, and Thomas could do nothing but urge the animals onward, praying for the shadow of a town or even a cabin where a midwife might dwell. Behind them, riding slow but steady, came two other men, strangers of different cloth, yet bound by circumstance. One was a gunslinger known only as Holt, a weary man with a revolver strapped low on his hip and eyes that seemed always to scan the distance as though enemies lurked behind every rock. The other was Reverend Cole, a preacher with a Bible, worn thin from use and a heart heavy with questions about the Lord's will in a land so merciless. They had fallen in with Thomas and Mary days before, when a river crossing had nearly swept the wagon away. Together, they made a fragile company, their bond not yet tested but soon to be. For the wilderness had a way of showing the truth of a man's soul. The prairie stretched before them, golden grass waving in the dying light, and the air smelled of dry earth and wild sage. A storm threatened on the horizon, not of rain, but of fate. For in the Old West, where law was often no more than the strength of one's arm, survival was a coin tossed between mercy and violence. And as the first star pierced the twilight sky, Mary moaned, clutching her belly, whispering Thomas's name. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew the truth. There was no town within miles, no doctor, no midwife, only them, the wagon, and the wild. The night came hard and sudden, as it always did on the plains, the sun vanishing into a violet shroud and leaving the wagon and its company beneath a canopy of stars. The air grew colder with each passing breath, the wind whispering through the tall grass like restless spirits. Thomas pulled the wagon to a halt near a stand of cottonwoods, their branches rattling against one another as though warning of unseen eyes. He climbed down slowly, his legs stiff from hours of holding the reins, and he circled to the back of the wagon where Mary lay against the pile of blankets. Her face glistened with sweat despite the chill of the air, and her breaths came sharp and shallow. "Easy now, Mary," he whispered, kneeling beside her, though his voice carried the tremor of fear. He was a man who had known cattle drives, barroom fights, and drought, but the sight of his wife in pain cut deeper than any wound. Holt, leaning against a tree with his revolver loose in his hand, glanced at her with eyes that betrayed little emotion. He spat into the dirt and muttered, "She ain't gonna make it far like this." Thomas shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel, but Holt only shrugged. "I'm just saying what's true. If she's to have that baby, it'll be here, not a mile further west." Reverend Cole stepped forward then, his voice gentler though laced with gravity. "He's right, Thomas. God may yet see her through, but she needs rest, and she needs it now." Thomas's hands balled into fists before he exhaled, shoulders slumping beneath the weight of their words. He knew it deep down, but admitting it felt like surrender. He rose and began preparing camp, gathering dry wood from beneath the trees, stacking it carefully as though the order of the branches might bring order to his thoughts. Soon a fire crackled, throwing light against the night. and the little group huddled close to its warmth. Mary's moans grew stronger, and every sound tore at Thomas's heart. Holt kept to the shadows, eyes never resting, his ears attuned to the dark beyond the circle of firelight. It was not only the woman's labor that gnawed at his nerves, but the silence of the plains. He had lived long enough to know that silence could hide more than peace. It could hide men waiting for their chance to strike. The preacher knelt at Mary's side, whispering verses from his worn Bible, though even he faltered when her cries rose sharp against the wind. Thomas returned to her side, gripping her hand with desperate strength, whispering promises that they would see this through, that she would live, that the baby would come strong. Yet in the back of his mind, doubts festered like shadows in the firelight. They were alone, without skill or knowledge, without a healer's hand, and in the Wild West, birth was as close to death as a bullet or a blade. Above them, the stars burned cold, indifferent to their struggle. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its mournful howl carried across the open land. Holt's eyes narrowed. He shifted his stance, thumb brushing against the worn grip of his revolver. The preacher continued to pray, and Thomas whispered to Mary, but the gunslinger knew the truth better than both. It wasn't just the wilderness that threatened them. Men were out there too, and men were often worse than beasts. And so, as Mary's cries pierced the night, Holt muttered under his breath, "We ain't alone out here, not by a damn sight." The night dragged on like an endless trail, each hour stretching into the next until time itself felt like a cruel trick. Mary's cries came in waves, sometimes soft like whispers carried on the wind, other times sharp enough to make Thomas flinch as though he had been struck. He did all he could, held her hand, pressed damp cloths against her brow, murmured words of comfort that sounded hollow even in his own ears, but still, the pain tore through her. Reverend Cole stayed close, his Bible laid open beside him, his fingers trembling as he flipped through worn pages, seeking verses that might steady both her spirit and his own. Every so often, he would lean close, reciting prayers about strength, faith, and the endurance of the righteous. Though his voice wavered like a candle threatened by the wind, Holt kept his distance, never far from the glow of the fire, his hand always near his revolver. He paced in slow circles, the heel of his boot grinding against the dirt, his gaze fixed beyond the camp. The man had the look of one who had lived too long in the shadow of danger, one who had learned that enemies rarely announced themselves with trumpets. They came quiet, in the dark, with knives and pistols. The cries of a woman in labor were not just suffering. They were a beacon, a call across the wilderness that might draw wolves of both fur and flesh. Thomas tried not to think on that, but every glance at Holt's restless figure reminded him of dangers he could not shield. Mary from. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, sparks drifting upward like lost souls into the black sky. Thomas fed it what wood he could find, but his hands shook as he worked, his body torn between exhaustion and dread. When he returned to Mary's side, she gripped his hand so tightly it felt her bones might shatter his. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice raw. "I'm so afraid." His throat tightened, but he forced a smile, brushing strands of sweat-damp hair from her face. "You've got nothing to fear, Mary. I'll see you through this. We'll both see our child come into this world." His words carried strength, but his heart hammered with terror. He had seen death many times before, on the trail, in fights, in sickness, but never had it hovered so close to the woman he loved. The preacher tried to hide it, but even he looked grim. His prayers grew shorter, his words more desperate. Holt finally stopped his pacing, stepping closer to the firelight. "She ain't gonna last the night like this," he said flatly, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had seen too many die. Thomas snapped his head toward him, fury in his eyes. "You keep your mouth shut if all you got is doom." Holt's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I speak what's true. I seen women in this fix before. Some lived, most didn't. And out here," he gestured to the wide dark plain beyond the fire, "out here, luck don't favor the desperate." The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into Thomas's chest like stones. Mary groaned again, her body arching with pain, and Thomas turned back to her, desperate to block out Holt's voice. The preacher put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Don't give up hope, son. If it be God's will, she'll endure." But Thomas could not stop the questions gnawing at him. Why would God bring them this far only to break them now? Why would he bless them with life only to threaten it before it had begun? He pressed his forehead against Mary's, whispering, "Hold on. Please hold on." The camp grew, silent except for her cries, and the occasional rustle of wind. Holt returned to his vigil, but the way his hand lingered on his revolver told Thomas he wasn't watching the planes for nothing. Something was out there, something he feared as much as the life and death struggle happening within the wagon. And as the long night pressed on, Thomas realized the truth. Their battle wasn't only for Mary and the child, it was for survival against whatever shadows moved in the wilderness. Drawn by the sound of suffering, dawn crept over the horizon, slow and unforgiving, painting the prairie in pale shades of gold and gray. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night's chill clung to the company like a second skin. Thomas hadn't slept a wink. His eyes were red, his face drawn tight with the weariness of a man who had wrestled shadows all night. Mary's cries had softened as exhaustion took her, but every breath she drew seemed shallow, fragile, as though each might be her last. Her grip on Thomas's hand had loosened, her strength nearly spent, and that frightened him more than any scream she'd given before. He looked to Reverend Cole, who sat slumped forward with his Bible still in his lap, his lips moving silently in prayer. The preacher's faith had been tested through the night, and though he had not faltered, Thomas could see the cracks in his resolve. Holt, on the other hand, looked unchanged. He stood at the edge of camp, revolver resting against his thigh, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. His stance was that of a wolf, wary, coiled, ready to strike if need be. Thomas hated him for his coldness, yet some part of him clung to the gunslinger's steady presence. For if danger came, Holt would not tremble. He would meet it head on. The morning brought no relief, only new burdens. The mules shifted restlessly near the wagon, ears twitching at sounds carried on the wind. The prairie seemed to quiet, as if it held its breath. Thomas tried to convince himself it was only the fatigue that made him feel watched, but Holt finally spoke what he himself feared. "Riders," the gunslinger said simply, his voice low. "They've been out there since before dawn." Thomas's head snapped up. "You've seen them?" Holt nodded once. "Not clear, but shadows moving against the grass. Too far to be beasts. Men, most like." Reverend Cole stirred, his tired eyes growing wide. "Bandits. Could be," Holt muttered. "Could be worse. Outlaws, drifters. Men who see a wagon, hear a woman crying, and reckon there's easy pickin'." Thomas's blood ran cold. He turned back to Mary, who stirred weakly, her face pale as linen. She needed rest, safety, a healer's hand, not the threat of men with guns and greed in their hearts. "We can't fight," Thomas whispered fiercely. "She can't be moved, not like this." Holt gave him a long, hard look. "Then we hold." The preacher rose to his feet, voice trembling but firm. "Violence may bring only more death. Perhaps if they see us, they'll pass on." Holt's laugh was dry and bitter. "Preacher, men like that don't pass on. They circle like buzzards, till the meat stops moving." Thomas felt the weight of the world crushing down on him. He wanted nothing but to shield Mary, to keep her safe. Yet now the vast wilderness pressed against them with threats from every side. He looked at Holt, at the gun on his hip, and then at the preacher clutching his Bible like a shield of faith. Two men, so different, yet each a piece of the fragile line between life and death for his family. Mary stirred again, whispering his name, her voice weak as a child's. He leaned close, kissing her damp forehead. "I'm here. I won't leave you." But the truth settled heavy in his chest. He might not have a choice. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the prairie. Holt stood motionless, eyes fixed on the distance, every muscle taut with readiness. The preacher whispered prayers into the wind, his voice breaking, and Thomas knelt at his wife's side, torn between love and fear, knowing that before this day ended, blood would likely be spilled, either hers in the struggle of birth, or theirs in the clash with strangers whose intentions could only be dark. The Old West showed no mercy, and dawn brought no salvation, only the cruel choice between fighting for life or watching it be taken. By midday, the prairie baked beneath the relentless sun. The sky stretched wide and merciless over the weary travelers. Heat shimmered across the grass, bending the horizon into waves that blurred what lay ahead and behind. Thomas's shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat, but he hardly noticed. His eyes never left Mary. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes whispering words that made no sense, sometimes clutching his hand with surprising strength, as though anchoring herself to the world. Each time her grip loosened, his heart seized with terror. Holt had moved further from camp, climbing a low rise to survey the land. From there he could see farther than Thomas or the preacher, though neither man liked what his gaze uncovered. When he returned, his face was grim. 3 riders, he said, keeping their distance, but they're there. Been tracking us all morning. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. What do they want? Holt's stare was as flat as a blade. Same thing all men like them want. Easy taken. Wagon, mules, food, guns, and maybe more. Seeing a woman here. Reverend Cole shuddered, clutching his Bible tighter. Lord have mercy, he whispered. Holt gave a humorless smile. Out here, preacher. Mercy's bought with bullets. Thomas stood, fists clenched, torn between fear and fury. He wanted to deny it, to believe there was some other explanation, but he'd been on the frontier long enough to know. Holt spoke true. He looked down at Mary, her fragile form trembling beneath the blanket, and a rage unlike any he'd known burned inside him. He would not let anyone lay a hand on her. Yet rage was no match for 3 armed men, not when he had no skill with a gun and no strength left in his body. Holt sensed his despair and drew closer, his voice low and steady. I'll hold 'em off if they come. Ain't the first time men thought to take what weren't theirs. Thomas looked at him, seeing something in the gunslinger's face that unsettled him. Holt wasn't offering help out of kindness. It was survival, plain and simple, an instinct as sharp as his revolver. But still, in that moment, Thomas clung to it. The preacher stepped forward, his voice unsteady but defiant. Violence breeds violence. Perhaps if we speak to them. Holt cut him off with a glare. Speak to wolves and you'll still end up meat. The words silenced Cole, though his lips moved in prayer. The hours dragged by, each one stretched thin by fear. Thomas tried to tend to Mary, cooling her with water, whispering encouragement, but his eyes flicked off into the horizon. Once, he saw them himself, 3 specks against the grass, keeping pace, never drawing nearer, never falling behind, like vultures, circling, waiting. His stomach churned. He remembered stories from other travelers, tales of men who preyed on the weak, who left no survivors to tell the tale. Holt's revolver gleamed in the sun, his only promise of protection. Yet Thomas knew even a man as hardened as Holt could be cut down when outnumbered. As afternoon waned, clouds began to gather in the west, dark and heavy with fret. The air thickened, the scent of rain mingling with dust. A storm was coming, and Thomas prayed it might scatter their pursuers, give them cover. But another thought gnawed at him. What if the storm only made things worse? A wagon caught in rain and mud was easy prey. Mary stirred then, groaning, her eyes fluttering open. Thomas, she whispered weakly. He knelt quickly, taking her hand. I'm here. Her lips trembled. Don't let them take me. His chest tightened like a vice. He kissed her hand, promising fiercely. They won't, I swear it. She closed her eyes again, slipping back into restless sleep. Thomas sat there, trembling, torn between love and helplessness. Above him, thunder rumbled across the plains, rolling like distant gunfire. Holt squinted at the horizon, muttering, storm'll break by nightfall. Question is, which'll hit first, the rain or those bastards? Reverend Cole crossed himself, his voice cracking. May God shield us all. But Thomas knew better. Out here, under the wide merciless sky, God's shield was as fragile as a whisper. Survival would come down to grit, blood, and the choices they made before darkness fell. The first drops of rain struck the wagon canvas like whispered warnings, soft but steady, promising the violence of the storm to come. The horizon had vanished beneath a wall of black clouds, and the prairie wind grew restless, whipping the tall grass into waves that bent and shivered. The smell of wet earth filled the air, sharp and heavy. Thomas knelt inside the wagon, wiping sweat and rain alike from Mary's brow as her body convulsed in fresh spasms of pain. Her cries rose once more, echoing against the vast emptiness, each one stabbing into his chest like a knife. "Hold on, Mary," he whispered, though his voice cracked with fear. "Just hold on a little longer." Her eyes opened briefly, glazed and wild, and she clutched his hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Thomas, the baby's coming," she gasped. His heart leapt into his throat. He knew nothing of birthing a child, nothing of what must be done. Panic clawed at him, but he forced it down, knowing she needed strength, not despair. Outside, Holt stood at the edge of camp, coat flapping in the wind, revolver already drawn. His eyes scanned the storm-dark horizon, every muscle wound tight like a coiled spring. "They're moving closer," he muttered. Thomas's head jerked up, terror flaring. Now, Holt said simply. "Storms cover in their approach. They'll use it to mask the sound." Reverend Cole stood near the fire, his Bible clutched against his chest though the wind threatened to rip it free. His lips moved in frantic prayer, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Thomas," he called, his voice nearly lost in the howl of wind. "You must prepare yourself. The enemy may strike at any moment." Thomas looked back at Mary, torn in two by the cruel fate before him. His wife fought for life inside the wagon. His child struggled to be born, and yet death might ride upon them from the prairie at any moment. The choice was unbearable: stay by her side and risk leaving them defenseless, or rise to meet the danger and leave her to suffer alone. Holt's voice cut through the storm. "Decide fast, Avery. They won't wait for your prayers." Thomas's hands shook as he laid Mary's down upon the blanket, kissing her damp forehead. "I'll be right back, my love," he whispered. "I'll protect you. I swear it." Her eyes fluttered closed, whether in trust or exhaustion he could not tell. He climbed from the wagon, the rain hitting his face like cold steel. Holt tossed him a rifle from the wagon's side, an old, battered piece Thomas had carried more for show than for use. "Ever shoot one of these?" Holt asked. Thomas gripped the stock, nodding stiffly. "At game. Never at men." Holt's mouth curled into a thin smile. "Men ain't much different. They bleed just as easy." The words chilled Thomas, but he steadied himself, planting his boots firm in the mud. The preacher moved closer, his hands shaking round the Bible. "This is madness," Cole cried. "We must try to speak to them, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity they carry." Holt's eyes narrowed. "You do that, preacher. Step out there with your book and your faith. See how far it gets you." Thunder split the sky, and for a moment the world turned white with lightning. In its flash, Thomas saw them clearly for the first time. 3 riders cresting the rise, their horses slick with rain, their forms shadowed but unmistakably human. They sat their saddles like predators, moving slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on the camp. A chill worse than the rain cut through Thomas's bones. These were not men seeking company, nor fellow travelers caught in the storm. Their purpose was plain in the way they spread out, circling like wolves around sheep. Mary cried out from inside the wagon, her voice raw, desperate, piercing through the thunder. Thomas flinched, torn, his heart shattering with each sound. Holt raised his revolver, steady as stone. "Here they come," he said grimly, "and they ain't bringin' peace." The raiders emerged from the haze of rain and mud like specters, their horses glistening darkly, hooves hammering the wet earth with a rhythm that made Thomas's stomach twist. They were 3 men, armed and grim, faces shadowed beneath wide hats, eyes cold and calculating. Holt stepped forward, rifle raised, voice low but sharp. "Stay in the wagon. Don't show yourself. Avery, let me handle this." Thomas barely registered his words. His focus was torn between the approaching danger and Mary's suffering inside. Each moan from the wagon sliced at him like a blade. Reverend Cole clutched his Bible as if it were armor, muttering prayers that were half command, half plea. The first raider pulled a short rifle from his saddle, raising it to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the camp like a man inspecting prey. Holt fired first, a sharp crack that split the air, and the man yelped, throwing his horse into a rearing panic. Bullets tore through the muddy plain, cracking against the wagon's wooden sides, and Thomas dove low beside Mary, dragging blankets over her to shield her from stray shots. Holt moved with preternatural calm, eyes tracking every movement, every twitch of the riders. Thomas, hard hammering, fumbled with the rifle in his hands. He had never aimed at a man before, and now, with his wife and unborn child at stake, he felt the weight of every possible failure. A second raider swung his horse wide, shouting in fury as he came close, but Holt's aim was true. The man lurched, rolling off his saddle into the mud. The third kept a cautious distance, circling like a wolf, unsure if the prey was too dangerous or just easy pickings. Rain pelted down, soaking everyone, making weapons slippery and movements unpredictable. Thomas's hands trembled violently as Holt barked instructions. Fire low, keep cover, protect the wagon. Avery, if you ever wanted to shoot for your life, now's the time. Thomas steadied himself, pressing the rifle to his shoulder. His first shot went wild, sinking into the mud beside the horse, splattering mud against the wagon's side. Panic gripped him, but Holt's firm hand on his shoulder grounded him. Steady, breathe. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the prairie slick and gleaming under the weakened light of a sun, struggling to break through the clouds. Mud clung to boots and wagon wheels alike, each step a reminder of how close death had been. Yet the air now carried a fragile sense of calm. Thomas sat beside Mary, cradling their newborn with trembling hands, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his chest. The child's cries, sharp and demanding, filled the wagon and washed away, however briefly, the terror that had gripped him only moments before. Mary lay back, pale but exhausted, sweat mingling with rain on her skin, and she smiled weakly at him. He's beautiful, she whispered, her voice soft and raspy. Thomas kissed her forehead, swallowing back tears. He is, and he's ours. We made it. Holt stood nearby, mud-caked and weary, cleaning his revolver with methodical calm. Even he allowed a small exhale, as if the momentary peace were something rare enough to savor. Reverend Cole knelt beside the wagon, murmuring thanks under his breath, fingers brushing over the child's tiny hand. Praise be for life, he said, voice quivering. But the peace was fragile. Thomas knew the raiders might return, drawn by greed or curiosity, and that the prairie held more dangers than just men. Wolves, snakes, sudden storms, and the merciless sun could strike at any moment. He glanced at Holt. They'll be back, he said quietly, as if stating a fact the gunslinger already understood. Holt's eyes, dark and calculating, swept the horizon. But we've got time. Not long, but enough to get moving. Keep that child close. Thomas nodded, wrapping the baby more securely in a blanket. Mary reached for his hand, fingers trembling. I thought I'd lose him. Lose us, she said, tears streaking her face. Thomas pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Not today, he said softly. Not ever while I breathe. The wagon was battered, the mules restless, but functional. Thomas inspected the damage, a wheel slightly cracked, a side panel dented, yet the structure held. Holt had done his part well. The raiders' bullets had glanced off wood more often than not, and his precision had been the difference between life and death. Reverend Cole, after finishing prayers, rose, brushing mud from his coat. We must move soon, he said. The prairie does not forgive lingering. Thomas agreed, lifting Mary carefully to her feet. Her legs wobbled, the strain of labor and the storm leaving her weak, but determination shone in her eyes. They bundled the newborn close, making sure he was warm, and Thomas gave the reins to Holt to guide the mules along the uneven trail. Each step was cautious, They could not afford another encounter. Not until Mary had regained some strength. Not until they reached a safer place. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine, promising new challenges ahead. Thomas glanced behind them, scanning the horizon where the raiders had disappeared. There were no signs of movement, yet he remained vigilant. Holt, ever watchful, remained at the wagon's side, revolver at the ready, eyes narrowing at every shadow. Out here, no one rests easy, Holt muttered. Thomas nodded, gripping the reins. I know, but we've survived worse. We will survive this, Reverend Cole added softly. Faith, courage, and vigilance. These are the tools we must carry. Mary rested her head against Thomas's shoulder as they moved forward, her newborn swaddled tight against her chest. Each mile was a testament to endurance, each moment a fragile triumph against the cruel expanse of the west, and though the prairie stretched endlessly, and the sun struggled to shine through the clouds, Thomas felt the glimmer of hope. They had faced death, storm, and human greed, yet life had prevailed. The baby's cries, small but persistent, reminded them that even in a land ruled by lawlessness and peril, miracles could happen. The journey was far from over. The horizon promised trials yet unseen. But for now, the wagon rolled forward, carrying love, courage, and fragile new life across a land that demanded all one had to give. And as the rain ceased entirely, leaving glistening blades of grass swaying in the wind, Thomas whispered again to Mary and their child, "We'll keep moving. We'll survive, together." The wagon moved slowly over uneven ground, the mud from the storm still clinging to wheels and hooves, each rotation a reminder of the grueling trek that lay ahead. Thomas sat at the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon as the wind tugged at his coat and whipped through Mary's hair. She leaned weakly against him, swaddling their newborn tightly, each small whimper a reminder of both hope and vulnerability. Holt rode slightly ahead, keeping a watchful eye for signs of danger, his revolver never far from reach. The prairie, though calm now, held secrets beneath its grass and ridges, secrets that could turn friend into foe in a heartbeat. Reverend Cole remained at Mary's side, murmuring soft prayers, his lips moving tirelessly as though the spoken words could shield them from unseen threats. The sun climbed high, casting harsh light and revealing the endless expanse of their journey. They had traveled days without sight of a town or a cabin, relying on the sparse knowledge of trails and landmarks to guide them. Hunger and exhaustion pressed against them like an unrelenting tide. Thomas's hands ached from gripping the reins. His body ached from the night's terror and the exertion of travel. Yet he refused to relent. Every step forward was an act of defiance against the wilderness, against the men who had sought to harm them, against the very lawless expanse that threatened to swallow them whole. Holt slowed the mules near a copse of low cedars, signaling a brief stop. "We'll rest here," he said tersely, eyes scanning the horizon. "Not for long. Keep alert." Thomas set Mary down carefully, adjusting blankets around the child. Her face was pale but peaceful for a fleeting moment, eyes closing as exhaustion took her. The preacher knelt nearby, whispering thanks for their survival thus far and asking for guidance. On the path ahead, Holt, ever vigilant, patrolled the edges of their makeshift camp, hand on revolver, ready for movement from any direction. As Thomas worked to steady Mary, a rustle in the brush made him freeze, heart pounding in his chest. Holt moved immediately, revolver raised, stance tight, and a figure emerged, not one of the raiders, but a man alone, ragged, weary, hands raised in peace. "Easy," Thomas called, relief mingling with lingering caution. The stranger approached, introducing himself as a trapper who had followed the trail of the raiders, but had not seen them himself. He offered food and warned of other bands of men preying on travelers farther west, painting a landscape where survival depended on constant vigilance and the ability to act without hesitation. Thomas listened intently, absorbing every detail, while Mary rested, cradling their newborn close. Holt remained skeptical, eyes narrowed, noting every gesture of the stranger, revolver never lowered fully. Reverend Cole questioned the man gently, seeking to discern truth from fabrication. Yet even as the encounter passed without incident, the knowledge weighed heavily upon them. The frontier offered no respite. Every mile forward was a risk, every pause a potential trap. Thomas realized that the West demanded more than courage. It demanded resourcefulness, cunning, and an unwavering will to protect those one loved. As they prepared to move again, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, heavier than any pack or storm he had endured. Mary's soft breathing and the faint coos of the newborn reminded him why he endured, why he pressed on despite fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. Holt checked the perimeter once more, then signaled for Thomas to lead the mules onward. The prairie stretched before them, endless and unforgiving, yet within it lay the fragile promise of life and survival. Every heartbeat, every cautious glance, and every careful step became a testament to resilience, the human will to persist even when the world seemed poised to take everything. As they rolled onward, Thomas whispered to Mary and their child, "The horizon is ours. We'll see it. We'll survive, together." And with that, the wagon creaked forward, carrying life through the vast, wild, and merciless expanse of the Old West, a fragile bubble of hope against a land that had no mercy for the weak. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the prairie as the wagon creaked along the uneven trail, each wheel struggling through the churned mud from the earlier storm. Thomas's hands ached, his back stiff, yet he pressed onward, heart tethered to Mary and the newborn in his arms. She sat swaying weakly in the wagon, their child wrapped tight in blankets, eyes wide and curious despite the ordeal of birth and travel. The tension of the past days weighed heavily, but in the soft cries and tiny movements of the baby, Thomas found renewed strength. Holt rode close, ever vigilant, revolver at the ready, scanning the horizon for any sign of returning raiders or the lurking dangers of the wilderness. Reverend Cole walked beside the wagon, praying softly, murmuring thanks for survival and guidance for the path ahead. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden grass waving in the late light, as if mocking the fragility of human life against its vast expanse. Every mile they traveled reminded Thomas of the cost they had paid: sleepless nights, the terror of attack, the storm's unrelenting assault, and the constant knowledge that any misstep could mean death. Yet life had endured. Mary's soft sighs and the newborn's coos reminded him that resilience, courage, and hope could exist even in a land defined by lawlessness and peril. As the wagon crested a gentle rise, Thomas caught sight of a distant settlement, smoke curling from chimneys, wooden structures glinting in the sunlight, and the faint sound of life carrying across the wind. Relief surged through him, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the West was rarely forgiving. Still, this sight promised safety, respite, and the chance to finally tend to Mary properly. Holt nodded toward the settlement. "That's our mark. We make it there, and we rest, regroup. No stragglers, no mistakes." Thomas exhaled slowly, gripping the reins, feeling the tension in his body loosen just slightly. Reverend Cole's voice rose in a gentle hymn, blending with the wind, a song of gratitude for survival and life. Mary leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, whispering his name, her voice trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We'd made it," she said. Thomas kissed her forehead. "We did. And we'll be safe now, for a time. We'll find help, food, rest, and you'll heal." The baby stirred, cooing softly, tiny hands reaching out, and Thomas felt a rush of fierce protectiveness. The trials of the past days, the storm, the raiders, the peril of childbirth on the open plains, faded slightly against the overwhelming reality of life. Holt rode slightly ahead, scanning the approach to ensure no threat followed. Yet his stance had loosened. He allowed himself a brief smile, rare and fleeting. Reverend Cole lifted his hands, calling aloud a prayer of thanks that rang across the prairie. Mingling with the sounds of creaking wagon and hooves in the mud, Thomas took a deep breath, allowing the moment to fill him with hope and determination. The West had tested them in every way, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. It had demanded courage, endurance, and sacrifice. And through it all, life had endured. Mary, the child, and himself had survived. As the wagon rolled into the settlement, the townsfolk paused, eyes wide at the sight of the weather-beaten travelers. Some offered water, others blankets, and a few came forward with gentle, compassionate hands to help Mary from the wagon. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a tension he had carried for days. For the first time since the journey began, he allowed himself to hope that they might live without immediate threat, that the newborn could grow in relative safety, and that Mary could heal in the care of others. Holt stayed at the rear, scanning the outskirts, vigilant still, though even he seemed to acknowledge that the worst had passed. Reverend Cole whispered a final prayer of protection for the family, his voice calm now, eyes shining with relief. Thomas knelt beside Mary, holding both her hand and the child close. "We've made it," he said softly. "We've endured. We'll endure more, but we're together, and that's what matters." Mary smiled faintly, exhaustion giving way to gratitude. The baby stirred again, tiny fingers clutching at Thomas's coat, a symbol of new life amidst hardship. And as the sun dipped fully below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold, crimson, and violet, the wagon rolled slowly into the heart of the settlement. Behind them, the prairie lay wide and wild, a land that demanded courage and tested hearts, but also a land where hope could endure, and life, no matter how fragile, could prevail. Thomas held Mary close, feeling the weight of their survival, the promise of the future, and the quiet pride of having weathered the storm of the Old West together. And in that moment, the man, the woman, and the child knew they had survived not just the land, the raiders, and the storm, but the trials that tested love, courage, and the enduring human spirit, forging a story that would linger in memory as long as the prairie stretched beneath the endless sky.